Thank you very much, Alex, for joining us today.
Pleasure.
It's great to have you. It's great to have you on the show. If we're obviously going to look at the SNP's current issues, the Scottish Government's issues, in the light of general election performance, and looking forward to this weekend's conference in Edinburgh. But I thought it might be useful just to take us back a little while first, because you've got this great narrative arc for the rise of the SNP to a position of astonishing dominance in Scottish politics, unprecedented dominance, really. No other party since perhaps the Liberals more than 100 years ago had dominated Scottish politics the way the SNP did in that period, 2011 to 2016, a bit after that to even 2020. Despite losing the referendum in 2014, you then have winning 56 out of 59 seats at the following year's general election. Another strong performance, Holyrood 2016. Then Brexit happens, and there is a sense that the national question is open again, that the 2014 referendum didn't actually answer it. At least that is the view that is prevalent on the SNP and nationalist side of the spectrum. So Brexit happens, and there is this sense, isn't there, within the SNP movement that all things are suddenly possible all over again. So perhaps could you take us back inside the room, if you like, at that period when, and give us a sense of how the opportunities were perceived within the SNP, and what kind of strategy there was to reopen the question, to force another referendum?
Well, the strategy and the agreed strategy right since 2007 has been to use the powers of being in government to demonstrate the benefits of self-government. Now, obviously, it's a devolved government at the moment, but the idea was to prove that the SNP in particular, but self-governing Scotland, would run itself much better than London would continue to run Scotland. And therefore, the idea was that we would demonstrate that this was a good advert for independence. It would show people the difference that independence would make if we had the full powers, if we could show, even calling it a government was the first thing that Alex Salmond did when he became First Minister. That in itself, I think, brought about a psychological change both within the Parliament and amongst the electorate, that this was a government. And people criticised it at the time, but I actually think that was a very smart move. Didn't cost a penny, really, but it was a good example, an exemplar of what the strategy was, to demonstrate a Scottish government can do far better for Scotland than a government in London. Now, since 2014, I think the strategy has still been the underlying strategy. The obsession has been, how do we get from where we are, and what are the techniques in terms of referenda or de facto referenda and all the rest of it. And that has dominated the debate inside the SNP and the wider national movement. My view is that's not the starting point. The starting point is, how do we persuade more than 50% or thereabouts of the Scottish people that independence is the way forward? And more importantly, or equally importantly, how do we persuade those people who are in favour of independence that it has to be their number one priority if you want to get it delivered? A lot of people tell the pollsters they're in favour of independence, but when they're asked to put their list of priorities, people always put their problems like education, health, housing, the economy, jobs. They don't put the priority as what they think is the solution to the problems. And therefore, I think the job is to persuade many more people. And that's again, the underlying strategy was supposed to be about demonstrating competence and ambition. And I think that has fallen badly by the wayside over the last 10 years.
Alec, you mentioned the words de facto referendum there, but of course, before the words de facto referendum fell from the lips of the former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, there was a period in the immediate aftermath of the Brexit vote where it looked as if we were in the early days of a new strategy forming. But of course, in the subsequent years, it became clear that there was no clear strategy, actually, in order to deliver a second referendum. Now, you were in the cabinet, and you ain't a shrinking violet. Other people were in the cabinet, like Jean Freeman, Mike Russell, people who are are pretty opinionated. So give us a flavour. What were you actually saying at cabinet level, and what were people saying within the SNP group at Holyrood? Because surely they must have been saying, where is the strategy? In the immediate aftermath of 2014, the party has over 120,000 members. These troops are looking for something to do. What is it they should be doing? Because it appeared there was no strategy.
Well, the first thing I should say, Bernard, I left the cabinet after the election in May 2016. The Brexit referendum was in June 2016. So I wasn't in any of the post-Brexit cabinets. But what I remember sitting listening to the press conference that Nicola gave the morning immediately after the Brexit referendum, when she more or less said, I'm paraphrasing, this is my excuse to hold Indy Ref 2, basically was the message she was trying to get across. 2 points. First of all, there was no clear strategy, and there certainly wasn't a thought-out plan at the time she said that, and there hasn't been really since. But the second thing, I remember being pretty politically horrified at the way she was playing it. In my view, and I said this to my wife at the time, and I said to my colleagues as well, I think she should have said three things that morning. Number one, although the Scottish people voted against this, the UK has voted with it. We are still part of the UK, so we are landed with it one way or the other. So we want the powers that are coming back from Brussels to come back in relation to Scotland, to the Scottish Parliament. Number two, we want the money that goes with those powers to come back to the Scottish Parliament. And number three, we need an inside track and be part of the negotiations with Brussels, because there's a very clear Scottish interest. Now, she didn't do any of those things. And I was told by a very, very senior member of Theresa May's cabinet the week after that, in actual fact, Theresa May would have offered some kind of involvement in the negotiations, but Nicola, in the meantime, had gone off to give a big hug in Brussels to Jean-Claude Juncker, and therefore they felt down south they couldn't trust her. So I think she made a huge mistake, because I think at the end of that, those three demands, she should have said, if we don't get those demands met, then we then have to consider other options. And clearly the other option would have been an independence referendum. But she was not prepared for an independence referendum. She had no strategy behind it. And quite frankly, I think they were as unprepared for how to deal with Brexit as indeed it turned out the Theresa May cabinet was unprepared for Brexit as well. And I think the result of the 2017 election, where we went from 56 seats to 35 seats in one election, demonstrated that she had totally misread the mood of the Scottish people at that time.
Well, of course, I think it's fair to point out and to remind listeners, of course, Alex, that you voted to leave in the Brexit referendum, yes, splitting with the majority SNP view. And you're there sort of suggesting, well, look, Brexit has happened, whether you like it or not, and so on. We need to accept the reality that it has happened. And that opens an obvious difficulty for the SNP at that time in terms of strategy, because if you accept the result of one referendum, then you kind of have to accept the result of the other major constitutional referendum of the last decade too, don't you?
Well, it's another reason why later on, when Nicola supported without consultation a second referendum on Brexit, my view was that was rather stupid, because it was very, very difficult to argue for a second referendum on Brexit, but at the same time, argue for a referendum that would be definitive on independence, because people would have said, even if you get a positive vote for independence, then you have to have a second referendum to confirm it. So I thought that was another indication of just responding tactically to evolving circumstances at Westminster, rather than having a clear laid out plan and strategy for how to use the Brexit situation to move forward the independence question. And I think she moved too quickly, because we'd only been less than 2 years between the independence referendum and the Brexit referendum was less than 2 years. So clearly it would have been very difficult to shift opinion within that time frame. So my view was you should have taken a longer term view, recognising that it would take some time to see how Brexit was going to work out. Now, as it so happened, the Tories made a complete fist of Brexit, and this, have been making a mess of Brexit ever since, and that could have been then turned to our benefit. But again, there was a total failure to turn the mess of Brexit to the benefit of the independence cause. And a very good example of that, I thought it was utter madness for us to facilitate a general election in 2019. We should have held out. And encouraged Corbyn to hold out as well, because it would have been the one thing at that time where we were in a very strong negotiating position to get a referendum would have been to trade that for allowing a general election in 2019. Because a vote of the House of Commons was required, and without our votes and Labour's votes and other votes, the Tories couldn't have had an election. So the opportunities that arose because of the mess of Brexit were never properly exploited.
Alec, we'll move on to more sort of up-to-date and current issues in a moment, but just maybe one final question on this historical point. What I'm not getting from you is any sense of unease within the parliamentary group at Holyrood, because we had this announcement the day after the Brexit vote. Then there was no strategy. Then we had COVID. And then when Nicola Sturgeon ran out of road in terms of a strategy, hey presto, we get the de facto referendum at the 11th hour. Now, all during this period, there are people within the broader Yes movement who have blogs and podcasts and what have you, who are having pretty angry debates about where is this strategy? Why is the leader and the First Minister doing absolutely nothing? Now, what were people saying internally? There's a big parliamentary group there. Surely people at group meetings must have been saying to the First Minister, where is this strategy? Why are you doing nothing? Why are you not exploiting the historical opportunity that Brexit presents?
Well, there was a small group within the parliamentary party, including myself, who were expressing this point of view. But the reality was that Sturgeon had a complete control over the government machine, the parliamentary machine, and the party machine. Remember, her husband was chief executive of the party. And anyone who spoke out, a lot of people were hoping to remain ministers or become ministers. So careerism definitely came into it. And also, when Nicola came in, much more than any previous leader that I can remember, she made appointments purely on the basis of loyalty rather than ability. Rules were changed for people being able to stand on the list, for example, in order to make sure that Nicola's acolytes became MSPs rather than people who might oppose her. So she had total control over the parliamentary group. And not enough people were prepared to speak out or to do anything about it. And of course, that led, in my view, to quite a bit of a chasm between not a chasm, but a difference of opinion between a lot of people in the party, particularly the activists in the party, and the parliamentary group, stroke Nicola and the government. And I think we're now seeing the consequences of that pent-up frustration breaking out in the last couple of years in the way it's done, because there was it was very, very difficult to have open debate in the parliamentary group or even in the party, because Nicola and her husband and her acolytes controlled the entire machinery.
Is that then the underpinning cause, do you think, of this year's general election result? That it's a hangover of the latter days of Nicola Sturgeon, and that Humza Yousaf was sort of seen as a placeholder and almost an interim First Minister who never really convinced the wider public, or perhaps even elements of the SNP party itself, that he had the kind of firm grip of government that would be desirable. Do you think that the election result, as I say, stems from the last 6 months or so of Nicola Sturgeon's time in office, or how else do you explain what is, by any definition, a catastrophic election result for the SNP?
I think it was a contributing factor, Alec. I don't think it was entirely to blame, but I think it was a contributing factor. And I think what had happened is that let us understand those election victories after the referendum. I mean, quite frankly, if my son's dog had been the party leader, the SNP would still have won these elections, because most of the reason why we won the elections in 2015, 2016, and despite the setback 2017, 2019, 2021 was still the aftermath of the election. I remember having a conversation after the 2021 Scottish Parliament election with Michael Matheson when we both were saying that was probably the last election when the aftermath of the referendum, the independence referendum, contributed significantly to the SNP getting a good result. And of course, nothing was replacing it. The problem was there was nothing there to keep the momentum going. If you look back over the last 10 years and you ask what major changes, improvements to Scottish life has the SNP made, you'll get an answer like baby boxes and stuff like that. But quite frankly, you won't get anything really big, like some of the changes that Salmon made. If you look at all the Salmon changes, and that's 7.5 years, there's far, far bigger, far-reaching changes, free tuition fees being a good example. Whether you're for or against it, it was a massive change. There was nothing as big as that. Nicola resisted reform of the health service. I put a paper to her as Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice in February 2016. She'd been talking about child poverty. I put forward a proposal for what eventually became the Scottish Child Payment. She replied within an hour saying she didn't read unaffordable proposals. I replied, how do you know it's unaffordable if you haven't read it? She was totally resistant to any really big reforms, big policies. She promised a lot in education and didn't deliver. She wouldn't allow the people in charge of, after Shona Robson became the Health Secretary, took on some of the proposals I was on for reform of the health service. And Nicola initially supported them and then backtracked and wouldn't support even reducing the number of health boards, something that's a fairly minor reform in the great scheme of things. So she was resistant to change. I remember that she gave the reason for her resistance to change as being that she thought that the changes to the creation of Police Scotland and the reform of the college sector under Mike Russell when he was Education Secretary, she thought that these showed the dangers of major reforms and she didn't want to touch any more major reforms. She was very conservative, small c, when it came to reform, and it was blatantly obvious. I mean, let me give you another example, because this is very relevant to the financial crisis they now find themselves in. When it came to signing the fiscal framework in 2016, I think 2015-16, Nicola signed it herself without prior consultation with the Cabinet. She then informed the Cabinet. Now, there was no point in fighting the fiscal framework. I thought the fiscal framework was a suicide note financially, but by that time it had been signed. But I did make the point that in order to safeguard our position, we had to expand our tax base. I suggested some kind of land tax, expand our tax base so that when the income tax revenues went down, we wouldn't need to enforce the kind of cuts they're now enforcing. And it became very clear to me that Nicola had signed this fiscal framework without fully understanding the potential consequences and ramifications of it. And we're now getting the consequences and ramifications. They've now signed a second one, which in my view is utter badness. It's another financial suicide note. For anyone who understands finance, you would never sign a document like that. And the result is we're now in a financial crisis, and basically they're allowing themselves to become a kind of Scottish post office for Labour cuts. Whereas in my view, they should be taking a completely different stance. There are some things where we should be saving money, for example, we're spending this year £160 million on cycle lanes, and we've taken £200 million out of the housing budget. Now, the three strategic aims of the Scottish Government are economic growth, tackling climate change, tackling poverty. You can't do any of these things without massive investment in housing. You can achieve every one of them without any investment in cycle lanes. And in fact, I think it'd be a real vote winner if you cut back on the number of cycle lanes that are being built at the present time. So there are things that can be done in respect of reprioritising expenditure, but they should still, in my view, introduce some kind of emergency land tax on the 6,000 or 7,000 big estates to close the black coal and show that we're not just going to be a post office for Labour cuts. We are going to do something different, which is within our existing powers.
Of course, Alec, in the run-up to 2026, the party has to fully understand what was behind the defeat just a matter of weeks ago. Now, notwithstanding that there will be unease about the independent strategy, let's park that to the side for one moment. And isn't it the case that one of the reasons why the party did so poorly is that its record in government is now coming back to haunt it? I mean, if we look at Humza Yousaf's tenure as First Minister, it did appear to me he could get very little right, and his sort of mishandling of the iPad situation with Michael Matheson just seemed to confirm that. And there is now a sense that whereas whatever you thought about them, whatever you thought about the SNP and government, certainly in the early days under Alex Salmond, there was a view this is a competent government. Whether we agree with the content of the policy or not, we think that the people who are running the country are competent. It now looks almost on a week-to-week basis and an issue-by-issue basis that the person at the top is taking the wrong calls on just about everything. And there is now a weariness and a sense that the party has been in power too long and it has no new offer at all. Forget the independence question. It has no new offer in policy terms. And unless something dramatic happens, it's difficult to see what it does between now and 2026.
I actually agree with that analysis, Bernard. That's why I was in favour of Kate Forbes taking over the leadership instead of Humza, because I believe that Kate was more competent as a minister. I mean, Humza's a nice guy, his heart's in the right place. I like Humza, but I never ever thought he was First Minister material. And with John is a reminder of all the mistakes made under Nicola Sturgeon, because he was our number one fan and he was Deputy First Minister at the time. So although he's only been First Minister for a short period, he's been there when all these problems were being created as a result of basically incompetence and failure to deliver. I mean, the ferry crisis, for example, had Salmond still been there, the ferry crisis would never have got out of hand the way it did. If you look at more recently, there is no way that our First Minister, Alex Salmond, would have allowed External Affairs Minister to go and have that meeting with the Israelis without making it about a complaint about Gaza, for example. The financial crisis, there's no way if Salmond was still there, you'd be announcing a cut a day to some essential services. And there's no way you wouldn't be fighting politically back against Labour and their abolition of the winter fuel payment, for example, where the Scottish Government has opposed it, but hardly very effectively. So I agree with your analysis. I think what we needed when Nicola stepped down, we needed fresh faces, a fresh cabinet, a fresh team of special advisors, fresh set of policies, and all the rest of it. Now, there are many areas where we should be introducing new policies. Just because you've been in power for 17 years, there are plenty of examples in Sweden and elsewhere of governments that have been in power a lot longer, but they refresh themselves on a regular basis. And there's been no real policy work done. I also think there's an issue, not just with the SNP, because all the problems we have had, by the way, are self-inflicted. They're not the result of anything the opposition parties have done. They're all self-inflicted by the SNP on the SNP, because the calibre of the opposition is as poor as the calibre of the cabinet, quite frankly. And one of the reasons happens is we've got far too many people who've never had a real job before they went into politics. They go straight to university, then become an MSP researcher or a parliamentary researcher, then become an MSP or a parliamentarian at Westminster, then become junior ministers and then in the cabinet. And they've never been round the block. And I think that shows not just in the SNP, but in all the major parties, both at Holyrood and at Westminster. I think Labour, in their abolition of the way they've handled the winter fuel payment thing, just is incredibly stupid politically. I would never have seen Harold Wilson ever making a mistake like that in his first 100 days. I absolutely agree with your analysis. Now, I think we can still stop a rout in 2026. I think it's going to be difficult. We're running out of time to avoid losing any seats, but I think we could stop her out. Let me give you some examples. Fill the fiscal black hole through a combination of reinstating the housing 200 million, for example, and not spending 160 million on cycle lanes. Means test not the poor people, but means test the people, for example, involved in the peatland restoration fund of 250 million, where big companies and wealthy people are getting huge subsidies for something they should be doing anyway. Why do we never means test the people who are wealthy, but we means test the people who are the poorest in society? So they should do that, and they should impose an emergency land tax in the large estates to bring in $1.5 billion. On the housing front, they have a proposal. I can't go into details for commercial confidentiality reasons, but they have a proposal for a £10 billion house building fund funded through pension funds on the table. They've had it for 3 or 4 months and they're humming and hawing. Any other government would give their eye teeth to get their hands on that kind of funding, which is in very, very generous terms, by the way. Abandoning the education reforms is madness. The land reform bill is hardly worth having. There's no radicalism in it whatsoever. It's not tackling the fundamental issues, as somebody like Andy Whiteman, no doubt, would tell you. So there's loads of things for them to do, loads of things, which would catch the imagination and get support. If you take, for example, my idea of an emergency land tax, the Tories would go bananas because land is a totem in some respects of Scotland's constitutional position down the years. The Tories would go bananas and the Labour Party would want to support us but couldn't oppose it. So politically, it would be a very good thing to do. Where's the imagination? Where's the ambition? Where's the energy and the dynamism? It ain't there. And they've got to really move quickly. They've only got 20 months left. And as you know, the result of the 2026 election is being decided now on a day-to-day basis by people's view of what Labour's doing south of the border, affecting Scotland, how it affects Scotland, what the SNP are doing or not doing, or doing badly or not very well. And probably the other parties don't really matter because it's either going to be a Labour First Minister or an SNP First Minister. And the other thing the SNP members need to understand is that this could be an existential threat to the cause of independence. Because if the SNP goes back into opposition after 2026, independence is off the agenda. Now, in Quebec at the moment, it looks as though the independence movement is having a bit of a revival. But it's taken 30 years to get that revival, and it's not even guaranteed. We'll need to wait and see the results of the elections in Canada, but in Quebec. But if the SNP lose power in 2026, it can be another 30 years, if ever, when we get the opportunity realistically to have an independence referendum. And I don't think there's a realisation in the parliamentary group or elsewhere in the party of just how critical this election is.
Well, in fairness, that kind of No. That's all excellent. I mean, in fairness, that kind of gap between putting the question a first and a second time would fit anybody's definition of a once-in-a-generation opportunity, perhaps even a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But let me take you back to a couple of things. I mean, it's fair to say that you and John Swinney have a certain amount of history. You ran against John Swinney more than 20 years ago to become leader of the SNP, and you lost to him then. But when you look at the First Minister's position right now, Swinney becomes leader of the SNP earlier this year. And the first thing he says is, look, I need to be very clear about this. I am no caretaker. I am in this for the long haul. Do you believe that?
Well, I think probably in John's mind, I think that was his intention. But if he loses the 2026 election in the 2 stints as leader, John will have led the party into 5 general elections in total, either local government or European or Scottish or UK elections. There'll be a total of 5 national elections, and every one will have been a disaster. So I think if it is a disaster, and I think he can avoid it being a disaster, but if it is a disaster, then I think John would very quickly want to go because we would be in opposition and appoint a new party leader. But I think the more important point is for him and for the party is to avoid a disaster happening. Now, the last couple of weeks have been hellish for the party, in terms of the way they've handled the financial cuts and the way of the Angus Robertson Israeli thing and all the other bits and pieces. Has not been a good 2 or 3 weeks for the SNP again. So they've got to get a grip. Now, John's there for the general election in 2026. Nobody now questions that. My view was that it would have been better to have fresh faces when Humza got elected instead of Humza, and when John got the coronation instead of John. It would have been better to have fresh faces. But that doesn't stop John from refreshing his cabinet. In fact, I think he's got to refresh his cabinet, bring in people who are competent, much more competent and able to deliver, who are more inspirational and prepared to pursue a reform agenda. I don't think
just on that, Alex.
Time is running out.
Just on that, I mean, who are these people on the SNP backbenches who have the kind of talent and vision that you think would merit a place in the cabinet, be an upgrade on the people who are currently around John Swinney?
Well, I'll give you one person who's been around for a while who would be an excellent finance secretary, Kenny Gibson. Kenny Gibson's a long-standing MSP. He's been finance committee chair for quite a while. That's his expertise. He's excellent on finance. He wouldn't have a learning curve, and I think he would handle it much more imaginatively and much more competently than is currently the case. Just one example.
Alec, let me paint a scenario for you in the run-up to 2026, or a suggestion of how I think it will play out. And get your view of it. All of these emergency cuts which are taking place in part because the Scottish Government baked into the budget an assumption that pay would go up by 3%, and they're signing off on settlements which are far higher than 3%, and I offer no criticism of that. I think it was the right thing to do for workers in a cost of living increase.
Absolutely.
But the fact is that you cannot commit to doing this kind of thing and then being surprised when you have a financial black hole which is entirely of your own making because of the choices which you have correctly made for the right reasons, without explaining to the wider public what the nature of tough political choices are. You might be able to take people with you if you have to cut in some areas in order to give people a decent pay increase. They might actually respect that. But the problem is that it looks incompetent in terms of the management in this. And what the government will do for the next 2 years is to do, to a certain extent, what a lot of devolved administrations do. They'll say, these are not SNP cuts. This is Labour austerity. And the problem with that is that it's an old song. It's a very old song, and people have been listening to the same record for a long time. And the problem is that I think that they will rely on lines which are obvious. I think they will rely on lines which will only be partially true, but they will rely on lines critically that nobody is going to believe.
Well, especially after the report yesterday by the Scottish Fiscal Commission, and the First Minister and the Finance Secretary rightly have held up the Scottish Fiscal Commission as a body. It's their equivalent of the Office of Budget Responsibility. It's run by Graham Roy, a highly respected economist. I think, as far as I know, always acted politically independently. And I agree with you, Bernard. I think it's hard to maintain that line the government is trying to maintain, given yesterday's report by the Scottish Fiscal Commission. Although, having said that, there is an element of the cost cutting that's entirely due to the cuts being passed on from London. But my whole point was, and this is why I was suggesting a different strategy, my whole point was that if you, for example, put an emergency tax on the landowners and you reprioritise that part of the expenditure, such as put the money into housing, not into cycle lanes, or, you know, at the moment we're giving concessionary fares to 60-year-olds when the original intention was it was for pensioners. At the time it was introduced, you were a pensioner at 60 if you were a woman.
Steady, boy, steady.
No, I'm fully on board with the screw the pensioner agenda that you're putting out here, Alex.
But rich pensioners like you, Bernard, can afford to pay your own. Can afford to pay your own bus fares. I'm absolutely sure.
Hey, I'm with you.
I think Bernard travels by taxi.
So there are sensible cuts, reprioritising of expenditure that could be made. But I think they've got to do something on the revenue side. I don't agree with the wealth tax and so on, because the only wealth you can tax that can't be moved abroad is land. So you're better to concentrate on a land tax than a wealth tax. If your wealth's in shares and so on, you can move that abroad anytime. So if they did that and said, you know, that would be popular. And they then could say, well, look, we ain't going to cut 400 teachers in Glasgow or anywhere else. We're not going to cut health services or social care services because we're bringing in this extra revenue from the broadest shoulders. And that's how we're going to run Scotland, whether it's devolved or independent. I think that would help get them back politically on where they need to be. I agree with you. People are now becoming tone deaf to the argument that you can blame everything on Westminster. I think you still could, in a logical sense, blame a lot on Westminster, but I don't think that's what the public want to hear. They want to hear what you're going to do to solve the financial problem. And if you do that, then I think you can win people back. But they show no sign of doing that whatsoever.
Well, I mean, you mentioned there the Scottish Fiscal Commission's report, and I agree with you absolutely, Alec, that it's a very significant intervention in the debate over not just the current spending astringency that is on the cards, but the broader shape of the Scottish state. Because, you know, one of the things that the Commission's report makes quite clear, for instance, is that, you know, across the UK, about 17% of full-time employees are employed by the state. They're public sector workers. In Scotland, it's 22%. And not only do we have a much larger public sector in Scotland, but the median full-time employee in the public sector in Scotland is paid £2,400 more than the median employee in the public sector across the UK. So if you want an example or a demonstration of why the Scottish government is in such straitened financial circumstances, that is it right there. You know, the wage bill makes up £25 billion a year. It's more than half the Scottish government's day-to-day spending resources. So it seems to me that there is plenty of opportunity for restraint, if you like, there. But you know, that then gets us into a broader question of, you know, what is the role of the state? What is the role of the government? How large should the state be? As regular listeners will know, I've mentioned this before. It's on public spending in Scotland from both governments now amounts to more than half of Scottish GDP. We have European levels of spending, but we don't actually have European or Scandinavian levels of delivery of public sector public services, do we?
No, I'm perhaps philosophically in a different place from you, Alec. I mean, for example, we have a publicly owned shipbuilding company in the west of Scotland.
And look at the great success that's been.
Well, actually, until certain people made a complete mess of it, it was a success, and I believe it could be a success again. I'm not going to go into the details of the ferry fiasco, but I think that was not their fault. They were handed something that they were given to by government, and which was impossible to deliver the way it was done, quite frankly. But my point is this: I picked that example because a shipbuilder is a what you would call, and I would call, a wealth creator. The fact that it's in the public sector, the private sector, in that sense, doesn't matter, because it's the creation of wealth. It's growing the economy. And there are many people, people who work in the health service are in many respects wealth creators. I mean, we're seeing just now the level of economic inactivity right across the UK. And one of the main reasons is the number of people who are too ill to work. And one of the reasons so many are too ill to work is because they're waiting 2-3 years to get an operation, to get a new hip or a new knee or whatever, because the health service isn't getting properly funded. So there's a whole range of these things, and I'm sure we can have a philosophical discussion on this. And it's a fair discussion to have. And my belief, that the public sector should operate efficiently. We should have value for money across the public sector. I don't think that's the case at the moment, but I do think that in the crucial services like education and health, take education, for example. One of my questions would be, if I were the finance minister, is let's look at the non-teaching, the non-frontline people in education. Every local authority has an education department. Now, when I was young, when I was at school, which is some time ago, we had one education authority for the whole of Ayrshire, one director of education. We've now got 3 directors of education, and they've all got deputies and deputies and assistant deputies and all the rest of it. And I wonder, instead of having all of that kind of bureaucracy, and some of it's necessary, obviously, but instead of having all the resources in there, why don't we get those resources back out into the schools? Because a lot of these people are former teachers. And I give you that as an example of where I think reform of the public sector is absolutely essential. As Health Secretary, I published a paper 6 months ago for Reform Scotland, listing the reforms we require in health. Nothing has been done of any substance. I did a paper on housing. Nothing has been done of any substance. One of the ways in which you can tackle the shortage of housing, apart from reinstating the budget, as I've suggested, is we should go back to doing what the new towns used to do. And that was build houses for sale as well as for rent, and use the capital receipts from the sales to cross-subsidise building houses for rent. That way you end up with far more houses overall, and particularly far more houses for rent. So enterprise and entrepreneurialism in the public sector is as important as it is in the private sector.
Alec, I know that you're a bit pushed for time, so we're going to we'll wrap it up with one final question, maybe trying to pull some of these various strands of this discussion together. Now, if somebody passes a copy of this podcast to the First Minister, and if the First Minister takes an hour out of his day to not so much listen to Ponsonby and Massey, but to listen to Neil, he'll find that here is a contribution which is crackling with ideas and various policy initiatives. I wouldn't bet that he is going to take terribly many of them up, because I think that there is frankly, a culture, almost an ideology of managerialism, which now strangles the creative thought out of most politicians throughout the various nations of the United Kingdom. And let me put to you that, given the analysis that you have given, that there are far too many people at Holyrood who are just career politicians, people who don't really think, a government which is stuck in a rut, a government which cannot think creatively, a government that will not take up some of the suggestions which you've made in this podcast today. Let me put to you that when you listen to the analysis which you've been very articulately explaining to us over the course of the last hour, you come to an almost inevitable conclusion from Alex Neil's analysis. He says on the one hand that all is not lost, that it can be saved, and you're absolutely right that the election in 2026 is decided now, not in a 4-week campaign in 2026. But given everything you've said about the nature of the people who are running the government and the people in the group at Holyrood, you would have to come to the inevitable conclusion, based upon your own analysis, that in 2026, it is more likely that the SNP will lose rather than they will win.
Well, I think the Sunday Times opinion poll, as it stands, showed that last Sunday, Bernard. And I agree, unless things change. Now, I do have some hope, because when I first met John was my research assistant in a private consultancy, economic consultancy that I ran. And he was
called Development Options.
That's right, exactly. And he listened to me and carried out very efficiently the ideas that I had. He's not an ideas person particularly. He's essentially an administrator. And, he is the First Minister. There's no chance of him not being First Minister and leading the SNP into the 2026 election. So I think I would say to John, look, you don't want to go down in history as the guy who brought it all to an end and it could have been avoided. And I would say to John, listen to what not just Alex Neil, but what many other people are saying, because there's loads of people with good ideas around the place, and you should listen to them. And I would say to him, start by reshaping your cabinet, bring people in who have ideas and who can deliver, replace a lot of your advisors who, quite frankly, are not up to the job, in my view, and bring in people who are up to the job, who've got ideas as well and can freshen the thing up, and bring heavyweights in. Bring Andy Whiteman in as your land advisor and get the land reform bill into decent shape. Bring people in on housing who are expert in housing, because the housing bill's a mess as it stands. Bring people like Professor Lindsay Patterson and Keir Bloomer in to advise you on how we need to proceed with the education reforms. Bring heavyweights in, not political WEANS who've just left university. They're message boys and girls. We want heavyweights in to deliver for the Scottish people. If you do that, you can turn it round, because all the evidence shows, although Labour got a massive majority, across the UK as a whole, they only get a third of the vote. Labour is not top of the pops, particularly after that decision on winter fuel payments. We can win, but we've got to change, and change very quickly. If we don't do that, we'll lose by default. And if we lose this election, independence is in the freezer for between 10 and 30 years.
The very last comment's probably the top line. If we lose, independence is in the freezer for between 10 and 30 years. Bin the political WEANS, says Alex Neil. Alex, thank you very much for your time this morning and for joining us. And it's been really, really tremendous to have you on and to listen to your thoughts. But for the moment, from the Ponsonby and Massey podcast, remember to get in touch with us, ponsonbymassey@gmail.com, at ponsonbymassey on X. But for the moment, for me, it's goodbye.
And it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me. Thank you.